On April 30th, the liberation flag flew over the Independence Palace, marking a historic turning point, ending a long war and opening a new era of reunification for Vietnam. From that moment, the South was completely liberated, the nation reunited. Yet across the Pacific, the Vietnam War became one of the most controversial topics in American history. Many Americans believed the Vietnam War was an unavoidable mistake, a conflict they felt the United States never truly had a chance to win, even from the earliest days of involvement. And then, reality confirmed it. The United States was forced to withdraw in an unfavorable position, leaving behind a pressing question: why did the world's strongest military lose to a much smaller nation? That question has followed scholars, politicians, and ordinary Americans for decades, and it is also the reason we undertake this analytical journey today. Before we go further, we thank you for your continued support, and now, let us begin by understanding why the United States chose to intervene in Vietnam. Right after the resistance war against the French broke out, the United States began paying special attention to Vietnam, viewing it as a strategic location in the ideological rivalry of the Cold War. When the plan to use the French as proxies failed, the U.S. decided to intervene directly, considering South Vietnam an essential defensive line to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. On August 17, 1954, less than 3 months after the Geneva Accords, President Eisenhower ordered direct aid to pro-Western governments in Indochina, marking the beginning of deep American involvement. On September 8th, the U.S. established SEATO, placing Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in its protected zone. This move sought to legitimize America's strategic presence in the region. By late September 1954, Washington and Paris agreed to coordinate efforts to limit Viet Minh influence while supporting Ngo Dinh Diem in building a strong government in South Vietnam. From November 1954 onward, the U.S. began providing direct aid to the Saigon government. According to Ambassador Joseph Collins, 90% of military equipment training and supplies came from the United States. However, America's expectations for the Southern government soon met obstacles. The Republic of Vietnam faced internal challenges, from governance and economic issues to deep societal divisions. The Diem administration was criticized for concentrating power within the family, with significant roles held by Ngo Dinh Nhu, Ngo Dinh Thuc, and Ngo Dinh Can, making the leadership structure lack consensus. In addition, strong-handed measures such as denounce and eliminate communists under the 1959 law heightened tension in Southern society, heavily impacting political organizations and nationalist movements. These policies, though aimed at stabilizing security, caused severe losses to revolutionary networks while increasing public dissatisfaction, especially among impoverished rural communities. Corruption and poor governance prevented the massive aid from Washington from being used effectively. When the U.S. reduced economic assistance, the South quickly fell into a food crisis. Despite various reform attempts, Diem failed to resolve widening social conflicts, and the most controversial issue was the religious policy that intensified tensions in the early 1960s. In 1963, the crackdown on the Buddhist movement made the situation more unstable than ever. Meanwhile, liberation forces expanded their influence and escalated operations across the battlefield. In response, a group of generals, with Washington's backing, launched a coup ending the rule of the Ngo Dinh Diem brothers. However, this change did not bring lasting stability. after Ngo Dinh came to power. The political situation in the South remained turbulent. Social, religious, and factional conflicts became increasingly visible, making the government harder to control. Despite efforts to strengthen the apparatus, Diem faced opposition from many sides. The concentration of power within the Ngo family caused numerous political groups to feel marginalized. The centralized style of governance prevented major decisions from gaining consensus. The lack of flexibility in leadership widened the gap between the government and the people. Notably, the 1959 Denounce and Eliminate Communist Law and its harsh punitive system triggered intense backlash. Many citizens felt surveilled, mistrusted, and unfairly targeted. These rigid security measures, though intended to restore order, caused significant harm to social organizations and nationalist movements. Dissatisfaction quietly spread throughout the South. At the same time, corruption and poor administration hindered improvements in daily life. Large amounts of U.S. aid were used inefficiently, resulting in low overall effectiveness. The crisis deepened when religious policies created profound resentment. In 1963, the Buddhist crisis erupted, severely diminishing the Saigon government's public image. The repression of protests and the self-immolation of Venerable Thich Quang Duc spread worldwide, placing enormous pressure on Diem's administration. The U.S. began doubting his ability to maintain control. Behind the scenes, Washington assessed that Diem was unlikely to stabilize the South, and a leadership change might be necessary. Several generals quickly responded to this signal. On November 1, 1963, a group of generals staged a coup. Ngo Dinh and Ngo Dinh Nhu were captured and killed. This shift in power opened a new era of instability. However, Diem's fall did not bring the anticipated stability. Southern politics fell into a cycle of repeated coups, with many governments lasting only brief periods. Not until 1967, when Nguyen Van Thieu took power, did the situation temporarily stabilize. Yet, heavy dependence on U.S. aid left the Saigon administration unable to stand on its own. After the 1963 coup, the situation in South Vietnam remained unstable. At that moment, the U.S. government began seriously considering direct intervention to prevent the expansion of liberation forces. During 1964 to 1965, the United States grew increasingly concerned that the domino effect would sweep across Southeast Asia. Washington believed that if the South collapsed, the entire region could tilt toward communism. In this context, the Gulf of Tonkin incident became the justification for Congress to grant President Johnson broad authority, allowing the use of military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution marked the turning point that brought the United States into full-scale war. Just months later, American troops began landing in the South, initiating unprecedented escalation. On March 8, 1965, the first U.S. Marine units arrived in Da Nang. What had been merely advisor warfare quickly transformed into direct engagement involving 500,000 American troops. Washington believed that overwhelming firepower and superior technology would quickly shift the balance. The U.S. adopted the search and destroy strategy, relying heavily on air power and highly mobile units. However, this strategy assumed the enemy would fight conventionally. Reality proved otherwise. Liberation forces employed flexible, elusive guerrilla tactics that were difficult to counter. The United States intensified Operation Rolling Thunder, bombing North Vietnam in hopes of cutting supplies and pressuring Hanoi into negotiations. but the actual results fell far short of expectations. Meanwhile, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the main supply route, continued to function almost continuously despite bombardment. Rapid repair camouflage and dispersed operations made American interdiction extremely challenging. Not only that, the U.S. experimented with weather modification under Operation Popeye, attempting to extend the monsoon season to disrupt the trail. However, limited effectiveness led to the program's termination. At the same time, the maritime Ho Chi Minh route, operated by the unnumbered fleet, transported large quantities of weapons. This made American efforts to blockade supply lines far less effective than planned. On the southern battlefield, the strategy of relying on body counts revealed significant flaws. Pressure to report success often led to inflated enemy casualty numbers, creating an illusion of victory. Washington believed that inflicting enough losses would eventually weaken the opponent, but liberation forces relied on broad civilian support networks, making this strategy fundamentally unsound. Many U.S. units described the feeling as fighting a shadow, an enemy who could appear and vanish in moments, taking full advantage of Vietnam's dense and complex terrain. While the enemy adapted quickly, U.S. forces were constrained by rigid strategy and political pressures. This limited their ability to respond to an opponent who refused to fight by conventional rules. By the late 1960s, it was clear that America's escalation strategy was not achieving its intended outcomes. And at that very moment, pressure from the media and the anti-war movement began to surge. On the ground, U.S. forces quickly realized that their initial assumptions about the enemy were inaccurate. The Vietnam War did not follow any conventional model they had previously encountered. The search and destroy strategy, built on overwhelming firepower and mobility, could not defeat a guerrilla force capable of dispersing, hiding, and striking unexpectedly at unpredictable locations. The Panyan count metric, originally intended to measure campaign effectiveness, became a source of distortion. Pressure for achievements led many units to inflate numbers, compromising strategic assessments. Meanwhile, liberation forces relied on widespread civilian support networks. They understood the terrain well, moved secretly, and disappeared before U.S. firepower could be deployed effectively. Many American veterans describe feeling as if they were fighting a ghost. The enemy appeared suddenly, ambushed swiftly, then retreated into dense forests, leaving prolonged psychological strain. Instead of direct confrontation, liberation forces used the tactic of hugging the enemy in combat. This neutralized U.S. firepower, making air and artillery support far less effective. Many battles showed that superior technology alone could not determine victory when the opponent was more adaptable. Forest terrain tunnel systems and resilience gave strong advantages to defensive guerrilla warfare. While the U.S. depended on large bases, the enemy dispersed into smaller units. This made large-scale American operations rarely able to locate genuine targets as intended. The Trung Son supply route continued operating despite massive bombing. Rapid repairs, camouflage, and route changes limited the effectiveness of America's interdiction efforts. Even when targets were hit, supply forces needed only a short time to recover. This demonstrated the shortcomings of Washington's initial expectations for bombing effectiveness. On the southern battlefield, relying on enemy casualties failed to reflect real territorial control. While the U.S. reported victories, liberation forces expanded influence in many areas. In reality, the U.S. struggled to secure pacified zones. Once American troops withdrew, liberation forces quickly returned, showing the lack of long-term sustainability. Air operations, though powerful, could not eliminate the enemy's flexible war infrastructure. Vietnam's air defenses continually improved, inflicting significant losses on U.S. forces. Gradually, the opponent adapted more effectively to U.S. tactics, while American forces faced limitations in adjusting strategy. This rigidity caused them to lose strategic advantages. By the late 1960s, most observers recognized the U.S. was trapped in a war with no clear path to victory. At the same time, American media brought battlefield images into every household. The appearance of the war on television changed everything. For the first time, the American public witnessed its brutal reality, something official military reports had never fully conveyed. When the Vietnam battlefield appeared on television, the American public witnessed the war's reality for the first time, far different from the optimistic reports the government had previously presented. The number of journalists in Vietnam surged from a few dozen to hundreds. Footage from the field showing civilian and military casualties caused strong shock across American public opinion. Evening newscasts became windows into the war. Around 86% of CBS and NBC content from 1965 and 1968 focused on Vietnam, attracting nearly 50 million viewers each day. Among them, Walter Cronkite, regarded as the most trusted man in America, held enormous influence. When he expressed doubt about victory, public confidence wavered sharply. As more tragic images appeared, the public increasingly questioned why was the United States fighting this war, and was any clear objective truly achievable? The anti-war movement quickly spread, from universities to major cities. Many marches gathered tens, then hundreds of thousands demanding an end to the Vietnam War. Norman Morrison's self-immolation, right in front of the Pentagon in 1965, shocked the nation. From that moment, the anti-war movement carried not only political meaning, but deep moral weight. In 1967, about 50,000 people protested at the Pentagon. 2 years later, the number rose to 500,000 in Washington. It became one of the largest anti-war demonstrations in U.S. history. In 1970, the Kent State shooting left students dead, sparking nationwide strikes. Around 4 million students took to the streets demanding an end to the conflict. Even so, U.S. officials insisted the protests would not affect policymaking, yet this rigidity only intensified public opposition throughout American society. By 1972, 2/3 of Americans opposed the war. Troop morale plummeted. Many soldiers fell into addiction, deserted, or defied orders, creating a severe internal crisis within the U.S. military. Returning veterans were not welcomed as expected. Many suffered psychological trauma and faced social stigma, as the Vietnam War no longer held public support. Meanwhile, the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 revealed that multiple administrations had been misleading the public about the war's scope and nature. Trust in government collapsed. These revelations, combined with rising public pressure, turned the Vietnam War into the central issue of American politics. This laid the foundation for major strategic changes in the years ahead. Tet Offensive 1968 became one of the most shocking events of the Vietnam War. The simultaneous attacks across South Vietnam caught both Washington and Saigon completely off guard. About 30 major cities, including Saigon, Hue, and many provincial capitals, were attacked at once. The scale and boldness of the campaign exceeded all American expectations. Images of U.S. soldiers airlifted onto the roof of the American embassy to regain control spread worldwide, becoming a symbol of the fragility of America's strategy. Although liberation forces suffered heavy casualties, the psychological impact of Tet proved decisive. Americans realized the opponent was not weakening, but still capable of large-scale coordinated operations. The Johnson administration's optimistic reports were immediately questioned. The American public asked if the U.S. was winning. Why was the embassy, a symbol of American presence, attacked? U.S. media described the event as a strategic shock. What had seemed like a reachable victory now appeared distant, shaking the confidence of millions. In Washington, many lawmakers argued the war could not be won militarily. Some even demanded a complete shift in strategy, moving toward peace negotiations. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had designed many U.S. strategies in Vietnam, resigned after Tet. This was widely seen as evidence of internal fractures. President Johnson, who had planned to run for re-election, announced he would not seek another term. The decision reflected immense public pressure and deepening war fatigue. On May 13, 1968, negotiations in Paris began. Though stalled repeatedly, they marked the first steps toward a future agreement ending America's military involvement. On the battlefield, both sides continued to fight fiercely, but strategically, Tet shattered America's confidence, turning the idea of military victory into a fading prospect. For many scholars, Tet was not only a battle, but a psychological turning point, forcing the United States to reassess its entire strategy and search for a path to withdrawal. After the Tet Offensive, the United States was forced to adjust its strategy. The Nixon administration launched Vietnamization, transferring combat responsibilities to the Saigon forces while reducing America's direct role. Washington's objective was to withdraw troops while maintaining a strong South Vietnamese government, but battlefield realities, along with public pressure, imposed significant limits on this plan. In 1972, the Spring-Summer Offensive unfolded across 5 major fronts. The 81-day battle for Quang Tri Citadel placed enormous pressure on the United States. Under this pressure, Hanoi presented a draft agreement on October 20th. Both sides had largely reached consensus, but signing was delayed after Nixon won re-election. When negotiations resumed, the U.S. proposed 69 revisions. To increase pressure, Washington launched Operation Linebacker II, a massive B-52 bombing campaign over Hanoi and Haiphong. Despite overwhelming firepower, Vietnamese air defenses shot down numerous aircraft. The campaign ended without achieving its objectives, forcing the U.S. back to the negotiating table. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The U.S. agreed to withdraw all combat troops, while turning primary responsibility over to the Saigon government. On March 29th, the last American soldiers left Vietnam. Their departure marked the end of more than a decade of U.S. intervention, leaving a significant void for the Saigon administration. Without direct American support, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam quickly weakened. In early 1975, liberation forces launched a major offensive advancing rapidly on multiple fronts. By April 21, 1975, President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned. Just days later, he left Vietnam, leaving the government in deep fragmentation and collapse. On April 30th, tanks entered the Independence Palace. The liberation flag was raised, marking a new chapter in history and ending more than 20 years of division and military conflict in Vietnam. The war ended, but left profound lessons. Many scholars argue the U.S. failed by misjudging Vietnam's core objective, national independence not threatening American security. For the United States, more than 58,000 dead or missing service members remain a lasting sorrow. The Vietnam War deeply shaped American politics, society, and foreign policy for decades. Though interpretations vary, the Vietnam War clearly stands as a major turning point of the 20th century and remains a global lesson on the limits of military power.